Welcome to this video on JavaScript loops and iteration methods. The first video is on the for loop, the very first loop you'll ever learn. If you're wondering why during the course of this video I keep telling you to pause the screencast, it's because these videos were recorded as interactive screencasts, and if you want to follow along and edit the code and play around with it, then please click on the links below and you can do just that. Okay, enough talking, it's time to code. Welcome to your first loop lesson. We're going to begin with the humble for loop. The for loop allows you to execute a block of code a specified number of times. We often use it to iterate through an array. The anatomy of a for loop is pretty straightforward, but we'll take a quick look. So we begin with our for statement. That's everything inside the parentheses. This typically contains three expressions. The first is our initialization state. The convention, since for loops are often used with arrays, is that this will be I equals 0. Here I represents the index of the array at 0. The next expression contains our condition, which evaluates to true or false. The loop will run every time this condition is true. And our final expression is what we do every time after the code has executed. Here, increment the index I by 1. Now, everything inside the braces or curly brackets is the code that we execute in each loop. It will become much clearer if I give you an example. Every morning I find myself stuck in a loop as I tell my daughter to get dressed. So let's put that in code form. My starting state is that I have not asked her, so my index of asking is at 0. I have to set a limit of asking, otherwise it would be a never-ending loop. So let's set that to 10. Then I need to increment my times of asking by 1. In each loop, I'm going to log get dressed. So let's run that. And here you can see we've logged get dressed to the console 10 times. But what if I'm feeling particularly impatient one morning and my threshold is much lower? Let's set a const max times to ask, and today it's just 3. Now I'm going to initialize times to ask outside of the loop. Let's update our loop accordingly. We'll remove the initialization state, but leave the semicolon. We'll update times asked to be less than max times to ask, and we'll increment times asked. Let's run that code. There, only 3 times. That's much better. We can also use conditional statements within our loop to give us much greater control. Usually in the morning, just before we get out the door, you'll hear me shouting, "We're late!" So here's a quick challenge for you. See if you can write a conditional statement inside our for loop that logs "we're late" instead of "get dressed" on the final loop. Pause the screencast, get to work on that challenge, then meet back here and we'll go through the code together. So inside our loop, above our console log get dressed, we need to add our conditional statement. We want to say if times asked is equal to max times to ask minus 1, and if that's the case, we're going to log we're late. Else, we'll log get dressed. Let's save that code. And you can see in the console that we've logged get dressed twice and then we're late. After all that yelling, I need to calm down. So join me for some recuperation in the next scrim where you'll be putting to practice your skills. And welcome to your loop garden. It's here that you're going to be returning in between all of the lessons to put into practice everything you've learned in one of our challenges. So let's take a quick look around. Our garden consists of a main with a class of garden, and inside that we have a number of divs, each with the class of plot. And what we're doing in the CSS is we are styling each of those divs. So if we look in our JavaScript, we can see our very first challenge. So our challenge is for us to sow seeds into these plots. What you will need to do is to create an array to hold all of the divs with the class of plot. You need to create a variable called bags and set that equal to 4 because we have at this point only 4 bags of seeds. And you need to use a for loop to loop through the divs and assign a class of seeds to each one. For the purposes of this exercise, one plot can take 1 bag of seeds. And if you're successful, you should see something in the mini browser that looks a little bit like this. You'll have 4 plots with seeds sown in them, and the remainder will be empty. Now, if you're struggling at all in this challenge, here are a couple of hints for you. You will need to use query selector all and class list. Over to you. Let's get going with this challenge, and I'll be waiting here when you get back to take you through. Welcome back, Gardener. The first thing we need to do is we need to create an array to hold all the divs with the class of plot. So if we look at the HTML, we can see each of these divs has a class of plot. Over in the JavaScript, we're going to create a const, and we're going to select each div with a class of plot using query select all. Then we need to create our bags variable. And we have 4 bags of seeds. Finally, we need to use our for loop to loop through all of the plots. So here we have said we're beginning at plot 0. We're going to keep looping as long as the plot number is less than our number of bags, and then we're going to increment the plot number. So what are we going to do for each of these loops? Well, we are going to select our array of plots, and we're going to use class list .add. And we're going to add our class of seeds. Okay, let's run that. And we can see in the mini browser, we have shown the first 4 plots. Now, I'm going to add one more challenge for you. Okay, here is your last challenge. I want you to write another for loop, and this time I want you to sow seeds into the remaining plots. We've purchased a number of bags of seeds. We have more than enough to sow all of our plots, so that's no longer a limiting factor. But I don't want you to re-sow the plots that have been already filled. Over to you, Gardener. You get to work on that, and I'll meet you back here and we'll check in. Good luck. Welcome back. So we begin with our for loop, and again we are going to let plot, but this time we're going to set it at plot 4. No longer limited by our number of bags, but this time limited by our number of plots. So where plot is less than plots.length. And finally, we are going to increment plot again. And we're going to do what we did before, which is sow our seeds at the current plot by adding the class of seeds. And now you can see we have filled all of our plots with seed. It's my belief that when you're using for loops, they can get very wordy. So I am going to revert back to using the convention of I to increment rather than plot. Let's save to check our work. And we can see that our plots are still sown, but in my mind, this is a little bit cleaner and easier to read.